Look, everyone keeps asking me what happened with Eric, and honestly, I'm sick of explaining myself to people who weren't even there. I'm Callista, I'm 23, and this whole situation is way more complicated than anyone wants to understand. I met Eric through our mutual friend Sienna at this house party 4 months ago. He seemed sweet enough, really into physical touch, which I appreciated since that's my love language. The guy was always doing nice things: concerts, festivals, movies, even this 5-day beach vacation that was actually pretty fun. Don't get me wrong, it was all nice and everything, but isn't that what boyfriends are supposed to do? If you're dating someone, you should want to make them happy and show them a good time. Eric was one of those guys whose mom clearly raised him to be super polite and respectful. Always opening doors, insisting on paying for everything, remembering random details about things I mentioned in passing. He'd text me good morning every single day, constantly checking in about how I was feeling, dropping whatever he was doing if I needed something. It sounds sweet when I put it like that, but honestly it started feeling like a lot of pressure. Between us, I was getting kind of bored. Eric was so predictable I could map out our entire weekend by Tuesday. Friday night movies at his place, Saturday brunch at the same cafe, Sunday afternoon walks in the park. He had this whole routine down and never wanted to shake things up. When I'd suggest something spontaneous, he'd worry about money or timing or whether it was practical. Everything had to be planned and safe and responsible. My friends would constantly tell me how lucky I was, going on about what a catch Eric was and how he treated me so well. But they didn't see what it was really like day to day. Sure, he was stable and reliable, but where was the excitement? Where was that butterflies in your stomach feeling? I'm 23. I should be having adventures and feeling that rush of new experiences, not settling into some domestic routine like we're already planning our retirement. I started noticing other guys more when we'd go out. Guys who seemed confident and mysterious instead of telling me every detail about their day at work. Eric would give me a play-by-play of his lunch break while I'm thinking about how there's got to be more to life than this level of predictability. His friend group was just as boring as he was. Nice guys who'd sit around playing video games and talking about work projects. When we'd hang out with them, I felt like I was aging 10 years in one night. I wanted to go to parties and meet interesting people, but Eric was always worried about getting home at a reasonable hour or not spending too much money on a night out. Here's the thing though. Eric really did treat me well. Maybe too well. He'd surprise me with my favorite coffee, plan these elaborate date nights, buy me flowers for no reason. But it felt more like he was following some playbook on how to be the perfect boyfriend instead of actually being spontaneous and romantic. I started feeling guilty for not being more grateful, which made me resent the whole situation even more. He was doing everything right, according to everyone else, but it just wasn't working for me anymore. I needed someone who could keep me guessing, make me work a little for their attention instead of just being available 24/7. That's when I downloaded dating apps. Not because I was planning to cheat or anything, I just wanted to see what else was out there. Eric didn't need to know because I was just curious about what kind of options existed beyond my current situation. The matches started coming in and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to have choices. Guys who didn't text back immediately, who had interesting jobs and hobbies, who seemed like they actually had full lives that didn't revolve around their girlfriends. It was refreshing to talk to people who weren't constantly asking about my feelings. That's when I matched with DeMarcus. Right from his pictures, I could tell he was different from Eric. He looked confident, had this edge to him that Eric completely lacked. Tattoos, motorcycle, some job that sounded way more exciting than whatever Eric did in his office cubicle. When DeMarcus messaged me, he was direct and flirty without being clingy or needy. We started chatting, and I felt this excitement that had been missing with Eric for months. DeMarcus would take hours to text back, which should have annoyed me, but instead made me want his attention more. He'd make these slightly inappropriate comments that made me feel desirable in a way Eric's constant compliments never did. I kept telling myself it was just harmless conversation, just talking to someone new. But honestly, I was already emotionally checking out of my relationship with Eric. I'd catch myself comparing everything Eric did to what I imagined DeMarcus would do instead. 2 months into dating Eric, I finally agreed to meet DeMarcus for coffee. Just coffee, nothing more. But the second I saw him in person, I knew I was in trouble. He had this energy Eric completely lacked. Confident, a little cocky, didn't seem to care whether I showed up or not. We ended up talking for hours, and when he suggested going back to his place, I didn't hesitate. Being with DeMarcus was everything my relationship with Eric wasn't. There was this intensity, this passion, this feeling like anything could happen. DeMarcus didn't constantly ask if I was okay or worry about my comfort level. He just took charge, and it was exactly what I'd been missing. I started meeting DeMarcus whenever Eric was at work. It was easy since Eric trusted me completely and never questioned where I was going or who I was with. Actually, that bothered me too. Like, shouldn't he be a little concerned about losing me? His complete lack of jealousy made me feel like maybe I wasn't that important to him anyway. Everything with DeMarcus felt dangerous and thrilling. He wouldn't always respond to my texts, which made me obsess over my phone, waiting for his messages. When we were together, he'd mention other women or talk about his exes in ways that made me feel like I had to compete. It should have been a red flag, but it just made me want him more. Meanwhile, Eric was still being his predictable self, still bringing me coffee, still planning thoughtful dates, still being supportive about everything. But now it all felt suffocating. I'd sit through dinner with him thinking about DeMarcus, wondering when I'd see him next, pulling away when Eric tried to hold my hand. I started picking fights with Eric over stupid things. He'd suggest a restaurant, and I'd complain it was boring. He'd want to stay in for a quiet night, and I'd accuse him of being antisocial. He'd talk about future plans, and I'd get irritated that he was being presumptuous. Looking back, I was creating distance to justify what I was doing behind his back. The lying got easier every time. I'd tell Eric I was going out with girlfriends and meet DeMarcus instead. I'd claim I was working late and spend the afternoon at DeMarcus's apartment. Eric never questioned me or seemed suspicious, which honestly made it feel like he didn't care enough to pay attention. After 2 months of this double life, Eric started pushing for answers about why I'd been so distant. He wanted to have these deep conversations about our relationship, and I'd get frustrated that he was being needy and insecure. I needed space to figure things out, but he kept suffocating me with his concern. That's when I realized I had to choose. DeMarcus was starting to make comments about how I should just break up with my boring boyfriend if I wasn't happy. The way he said it made it sound so obvious and simple. So I made my decision. I was choosing excitement over security, passion over stability. I was 23 and deserved to be with someone who made me feel alive, instead of settling for someone safe just because he treated me well on paper. When Eric cornered me for that serious talk, I could have lied again, but I was tired of pretending. I told him everything, that I'd been seeing someone else for 2 months, that I wasn't happy, that I needed something different than what he could give me. Eric just sat there looking shocked while I explained about DeMarcus and how we'd been hooking up. Instead of getting angry or fighting for me, he just asked why and what he'd done wrong. That's when I knew for sure I was making the right choice. A real man would have shown some fire, some passion, some fight. But Eric just sat there looking defeated, asking what he could do to change my mind. I tried to explain that I needed someone with more edge, someone exciting who wasn't so predictable. Eric looked at me like he couldn't understand what I was talking about, which proved how wrong we were for each other. He didn't yell or fight or show any real emotion, which was honestly disappointing. I wanted him to prove that losing me actually mattered to him. Instead, he just processed what I'd told him and asked logical questions about where we went wrong. The next morning, when I tried texting to check on him, my messages weren't going through. He'd blocked me on everything: social media, phone, even payment apps. It seemed like such an overreaction to cut me off completely instead of handling things maturely. I moved in with DeMarcus pretty quickly after that. His place was nothing like Eric's organized apartment. Clothes everywhere, empty bottles, motorcycle parts scattered around. but it felt real and authentic instead of like some sterile showroom. Living with DeMarcus was everything I thought I wanted. Every day was unpredictable and exciting. Sometimes he'd come home with last-minute concert tickets, or we'd drive to another city just because he felt like it. He didn't plan everything to death like Eric. He just lived in the moment. Sure, there were adjustments. DeMarcus wasn't as financially stable as Eric, so I ended up covering more expenses than I was used to. But that felt more equal than Eric always insisting on paying for everything, which now seemed controlling. DeMarcus also wasn't as communicative as Eric had been. He didn't text constantly or always want to know how I was feeling. At first, I missed that attention, but then I realized it was probably healthier. Eric had been so clingy and needy, always requiring reassurance. 3 months after leaving Eric, I was at this coffee shop with DeMarcus when I spotted Eric across the room. My heart did this weird flutter when I saw him, which caught me off guard. He looked really good. Different haircut, like he'd been working out, more confident than I remembered. I waved to be friendly, but he looked right at me and deliberately looked away. It stung more than I expected. We could at least acknowledge each other like adults. The whole time we were there, DeMarcus was on his phone ignoring me while I kept glancing at Eric. When Eric left, he walked right past our table without looking at me. Seeing Eric looking so put together and confident bothered me more than it should have. I'd expected him to look heartbroken or at least affected by our breakup, but he seemed to be thriving. It made me wonder what he'd been doing with his time since we broke up. But I pushed those thoughts away because I'd made my choice for good reasons. Eric had been boring and predictable, even if he'd been reliable. DeMarcus brought excitement to my life, even if it also brought chaos and uncertainty. Living with DeMarcus was getting more complicated, though. What had seemed like passionate intensity was starting to feel like walking on eggshells. He'd get moody for no reason I could figure out, and when I'd ask what was wrong, he'd accuse me of being needy. DeMarcus started checking my phone when I wasn't around. At first, I told myself it was because he cared and wanted to make sure I was safe, but it felt different from Eric's gentle concern. When Eric worried about me, it came from love. When DeMarcus got suspicious, it felt controlling. He'd question me if I was even 10 minutes late getting home. If I mentioned a male coworker, DeMarcus would spend hours grilling me about it. I started editing my stories to avoid setting him off, which meant basically lying about harmless interactions. The fights were getting more intense, too. Eric and I used to have calm discussions when we disagreed, but DeMarcus would explode over tiny things. He'd yell and throw things and make me feel crazy for bringing up legitimate concerns. I found myself missing Eric's emotional stability more than I wanted to admit. With Eric, I'd always felt safe to express my feelings or bring up problems. With DeMarcus, I never knew if he'd be understanding or if he'd turn it into a huge fight. DeMarcus also didn't have his life together the way Eric had. He was constantly behind on bills, couldn't keep steady work, and expected me to cover more and more expenses. I started resenting that I was basically supporting both of us. When I'd try to talk about our financial situation, DeMarcus would get defensive and accuse me of being materialistic. He'd say at least he wasn't some boring office drone like my ex, and I should appreciate that he was a free spirit. But honestly, Eric's stability was starting to look appealing compared to wondering if we'd make rent each month. Eric had never made me worry about money or having a roof over my head. Meanwhile, I'd hear through friends that Eric was doing really well. He'd gotten promoted, was taking classes, had joined a gym. People said he seemed happier and more confident than ever. Part of me was glad for him, but part of me was hurt that he was thriving without me. The breaking point came when DeMarcus grabbed my wrist during an argument and squeezed hard enough to leave bruises. He'd been drinking and accused me of flirting with some guy at a party. When I tried to defend myself, he got physical in a way that actually scared me. He apologized the next morning, said he'd been drunk and stressed that it would never happen again. But I couldn't stop thinking about how Eric had never once made me feel physically unsafe, even during our worst disagreements. 6 months after that incident, I finally left DeMarcus. It wasn't easy. He'd isolated me from most of my friends, and I'd become financially dependent on supporting him, which was backwards, but somehow, that's how it worked out. I moved back in with my parents, which was humiliating at 24. Having to explain why my exciting relationship had fallen apart was embarrassing, especially since they'd clearly preferred Eric. The hardest part was admitting how wrong I'd been about everything. I'd given up a stable, loving relationship for chaos, with someone who turned out to be controlling and abusive. I kept thinking about Eric and wondering how he was doing. Through social media, I could see he was still thriving. He'd moved to a nicer place, seemed to have an active social life, looked happy and healthy. I reached out to Sienna to ask if she'd heard anything about Eric. She told me he was dating someone new, a woman he'd met through work who seemed really nice and treated him well. The news hit me harder than I expected. Hearing that Eric had moved on made me realize what I'd actually lost. It wasn't just a boring relationship. It was someone who'd loved me unconditionally and treated me better than I deserved. Now he was giving all that care and devotion to someone else. I started obsessing over his new girlfriend, checking her social media constantly. She seemed perfect for him. Sweet, supportive, appreciative of his kindness, instead of taking it for granted like I had. I began having fantasies about reaching out to Eric and explaining everything that happened with DeMarcus. In my mind, he'd realize I'd learned from my mistakes and would want to give us another chance. 2 years after our breakup, I saw the announcement that destroyed me. Eric was engaged. The photos showed him with this woman who looked genuinely happy, and the comments were full of people congratulating them and talking about what a perfect couple they made. I stared at those engagement photos for hours, reading every comment. Eric looked incredible, confident, successful, genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen before. His fiancée looked like everything I wasn't: grateful, supportive, the kind of woman who would appreciate what she had. The ring was beautiful and obviously expensive, which meant Eric was doing well financially. I read that he'd gotten another promotion and was thriving in his career. Meanwhile, I was still struggling to get my life together. I felt this overwhelming sense of loss that I hadn't expected. Seeing Eric so happy with someone else made me realize what I'd given up when I left him for DeMarcus. I started obsessing over their relationship, checking both their social media accounts constantly. They looked happy in every photo, traveling, at dinner parties, casual pictures around the house. She'd post captions about how grateful she was to have found him. Reading her posts made me angry, because she was getting credit for appreciating Eric when I'd been with him first. She was acting like she'd discovered this amazing man when I'd already done the relationship work. Since Eric still had me blocked everywhere, I created a fake account and sent him a long message. I explained how wrong I'd been about DeMarcus, how much I'd come to appreciate Eric's qualities, how much I regretted throwing away what we'd had. I told him about how badly DeMarcus had treated me, thinking that would make him feel protective. I explained that I'd been young and stupid, that I'd learned from my mistakes, that I was ready to be the girlfriend he deserved. But Eric never responded. I waited for weeks, checking constantly, but he probably deleted it without reading, or his fiancée saw it first and made him block my fake account too. The wedding was approaching, and I was running out of options. I found out when and where it was happening through social media. I knew it was crazy, but I decided to go and try to talk to Eric before the ceremony. When I got to the venue, there was security, and I couldn't get close without an invitation. I watched from across the street as guests arrived, looking happy and excited. I felt like an outsider looking at the life I could have had. I saw Eric arrive, and he looked incredible, confident, handsome, genuinely joyful. His bride was beautiful and glowing, surrounded by people who clearly adored her. They looked like they belonged together, in a way Eric and I never had. Standing there watching Eric's wedding, I realized I'd lost him forever. He'd found someone who appreciated him and made him happy in ways I never had. 6 months after Eric's wedding, I was still struggling to move on. I'd tried dating but couldn't stop comparing everyone to Eric and finding them lacking. None of them had his kindness, his reliability, his genuine care. My friends were tired of hearing about Eric and kept telling me I needed to move on. But they didn't understand what I'd lost when I left him. A year after his wedding, I saw an announcement that made my stomach drop. Eric's wife was pregnant. They looked so happy in the photo, both glowing with excitement about starting a family. This felt like the final proof that Eric was never coming back. He wasn't just married, he was building a family with someone else. I decided to make one final attempt and wrote him a real letter that I mailed to his house. I told him how sorry I was, how much I'd grown since our breakup, how happy I was that he'd found love with someone who deserved him. But Eric never responded to my letter either. 3 months later, I saw the birth announcement. Eric and his wife had a healthy baby boy, and they looked exhausted but blissfully happy. Eric was a father now, building this beautiful life with his family while I wasn't part of it at all. I was just some girl from his past that he'd rather forget. I tried moving to Houston to start over, thinking maybe distance would help me forget Eric. But even there, I couldn't escape thinking about him constantly. Now I'm 28, and I realize this is my life. I'm the girl who had true love and threw it away for someone exciting who turned out to be garbage. Eric is never coming back, and honestly, why should he? Everyone tells me I need to move on, that obsessing over Eric is unhealthy. But they don't understand that Eric wasn't just some ex-boyfriend. He was the person who showed me what real love looked like. I've tried dating other people, but they all fall short. They're either boring like I used to think Eric was, or exciting like DeMarcus, but just as unreliable and selfish. Sometimes I wonder if I've idealized Eric in my memory, but then I remember specific moments. How he'd bring me coffee exactly how I liked it, how he'd listen to me vent about work, how safe I felt with him. And I know it was real. The therapists keep asking what I learned, and I tell them I learned not to take good people for granted. But that doesn't help me now because Eric is gone and I can't apply that lesson to him anymore. Now I'm alone in Houston where nobody knows about Eric, and I can pretend to be someone who just hasn't found the right person yet. But the truth is, I did find the right person, and I chose someone else because I thought I deserved better. The worst part is, Eric probably doesn't think about me at all anymore. He's busy with his wife and kid, living this full, happy life that doesn't include me. Meanwhile, I think about him constantly. People ask what I want in a relationship now, and the answer is Eric. I want Eric back. I want a do-over where I'm smart enough to recognize what I have. But that's never going to happen because some mistakes you don't get to undo. So this is my life, alone at 28, comparing everyone to someone I lost years ago, knowing I had my shot at happiness and blew it. Eric is living his best life with someone who deserves him, and I'm dealing with the consequences of thinking I could do better. Maybe some people only get one chance at real love, and mine is over. Maybe this is what my life looks like now. Always wondering what might have been, always knowing that the best thing that ever happened to me is something I chose to walk away from. The funny thing is, if someone asked what advice I'd give to girls dating good guys, I'd tell them to appreciate what they have. Don't make my mistake. Don't throw away something real for something that just looks more exciting. But nobody asks me for relationship advice anymore because everyone knows I'm the cautionary tale. I'm the girl who had everything and lost it because I didn't know what I had until it was gone. That's my story. That's how I went from being loved by the best man I'll ever know to being alone and bitter, still missing someone who probably doesn't remember my middle name.